You are now listening to the Going North podcast, where you'll receive tips and techniques to advance yourself. I'm your host, Dom Brightman, and every week we're going to be hearing from an author who's going to share their expertise to help you charge forward in life. On a quick side note, be sure to check out Going North the book. It's available in ebook, audio, as well as paperback form for those who love to read a traditional book. Now let's get on with the show. And today on the Going North podcast, we have, you guessed it, another author, but not just any author. Today we have one heck of a wonderful lady right here where helping hurting people is her passion. And that is what folks need nowadays, because folks are going through some tough times. They may be out of jobs, looking for a new one. They may have still recovering through a broken relationship, or in some cases PTSD. And this wonderful lady right here is a counselor and a teacher, among many other things. And I'm talking about the wonderful LZ herself, Miss Lucille Zimmerman. How are you today, ma'am?
Hi, Dom. I'm doing great. Thank you. I don't know if I've ever been called LZ, but I love it.
Sweet. Yeah, your new middle name could be Love, so LZ for Love Zimmerman. There we go.
Oh, okay. How's your morning going, Dom?
Oh, my morning is going north.
Good.
Yes, ma'am, indeed. So mind filling in some blanks where I may have missed some things in the introduction?
Sure. Well, I live here in Littleton, Colorado, which is a suburb of Denver. And I was just telling Dom what a beautiful day it is here today. There's not a cloud in the sky, and I'm, 53. I have 2 grown kids. I have a little grandbaby that's 2, and she's the light of my life. And then I'm a counselor, licensed professional counselor, and have been a teacher at Colorado Christian University. And I'm an author of 2 books that are on Amazon. So I was excited that you are giving me this opportunity to visit with you on your podcast.
Oh, yes, ma'am, indeed. And I believe the first one, I think, was Upside of Down. That's an Amazon bestseller, right?
My first book was a traditionally published book in the Christian realm, and it's called Renewed. And that's a book I wrote after, people might not know this, but when you go through a counseling program to learn how to be a counselor, you may not know it, but they usually, if it's a good program, they require you to kind of deal with all your own issues. So, all your past pain, you have to kind of work through it. And it may not be deliberate, but it's just kind of a byproduct of working through different things and learning things. You are suddenly faced, you confront all your own demons. So that first book came out of that experience, having to deal with some trauma in my own childhood, and what helped and what didn't, and what tools I use with my own clients. So all of those are in the book called Renewed. And then about 5 years later, I wrote a book called Finding the Upside of Down, How Tragedy Can Lead to Remarkable and Dramatic Breakthroughs. And one of the things I love to do, Dom, is research. So I love to get into the clinical literature and really look at what science and research has to say about what helps people. And I love to study post-traumatic stress and trauma, and then try to understand, okay, what helps somebody, who survives a 9/11 or a car crash or sexual abuse. And so that's what I wrote about in this book. Is I kind of talk about what is trauma. I kind of define it, and then I start talking about this topic called post-traumatic growth, which is so fascinating because 50% of people who go through something really traumatic actually say that it's the thing that launched them into a better place in life. And it doesn't deny all the hurt and the pain and the suffering, but almost 50% of people are able to say that it launches them to a better place, like either closer relationships or more purpose or deeper spirituality. So that's what I wanted to know when I did the research, is who grows and who doesn't, and what are the conditions necessary for that.
And I did like the fact that you mentioned post-traumatic growth, because you're actually right. It's kind of goes back to a saying that I feel like is a little cliche in the self-help field, is pain to power. I mean, a lot of folks may just need that catalyst to launch them forward.
Mhm. And I think on one level, most people kind of know this. They're like, oh, I can use these hard things and get better, not bitter, or whatever. But there were actually some really specific things that had to happen in order for people to grow. And I know we've all met people who don't grow, who stay stuck, and they're victims, or they just can't move out of that hurt, broken place. And so that was the question that led my book. What are those conditions necessary? There was a really interesting story I read that kind of spurred this research for me. Let me see if I can read the name of the book. It's called What Doesn't Kill Us by Dr. Stephen Joseph. And he was a researcher or psychologist from Northern Ireland. And there was this ferry accident in Belgium in the 80s. And I don't know exactly the whole story. I think someone didn't close the doors on the bottom of the ferry. And so within 90 seconds, the water came in, and it toppled this ferry after everyone had loaded. And there were like 500 or 600 people on board, and several drowned. So this researcher was tracking the survivors and studying how they were doing, and just randomly he decided he was going to throw a question in the survey, and one of the questions was, has anything turned out better? And he was stunned because 46% said, actually, everything's better. Like, this has launched me into a much better place in life. And he was just shocked. He wasn't expecting that at all. And so that's kind of when the research started, was in the, I'd say 70s and 80s. And there are two professors in North Carolina that are most famous for the research, Tedeschi and Dr. Calhoun. So they're the ones, but now a lot of people are studying this idea, and so it's really an interesting topic.
Yes, it is indeed. I mean, it's really interesting indeed, because you may think it's like, oh, bed of roses, woohoo, soft life, things will be great. But then it's like, nope, the trials and putting your feet to the fire is really where the refining begins, where the growth begins.
Yeah, and it's not the horrific car accident or whatever. It's not the event itself that causes or promotes the growth, but it's that wrestling after something horrible happens. I'd like to share the most fascinating thing I learned from the research, and that was, well, I kind of have to set it up for a minute here, but as counselors, we are trained, most of us are trained to teach people to ruminate. And I don't know if you know what rumination is, but it's, where you're laying in bed and you're thinking, why me? Why did that have to happen? Or why did he break up with me? Or, you're just obsessing, and it's kind of like a cow chewing its cud over and over and over. You're like, why? Well, as counselors, we teach people not to do that because it causes depression. And yet, in my research, that rumination piece was one of the most critical things that you had to do in order to have post-traumatic growth after something traumatic. And so here we're telling people, don't do that. Don't lay there and obsess about it. And actually, it's one of the most important criteria. But it has to be a certain kind of obsessing. You have to, instead of saying, why me, it has to be more of a positive thing. Like, okay, this happened. What am I going to do about it? How am I going to move forward? How am I going to make meaning out of this? How am I going to give my life purpose? So it has to be a certain kind of rumination that happens. And that was fascinating to me.
Yeah, and it makes sense when you say that, because it's like some folks are like, hey, don't think about it. Don't do the ruminations. Don't do it. But at the same time, it's like, wait a second. Even though you're thinking about it a lot, you may find some holes in some of those thoughts that may lead to a new discovery. It's like, hey, wait a second, this happened because of this, or this car crash happened probably for a good reason. I probably needed to be out of commission so I can actually think, because I forgot to do some thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, one of my favorite stories in the book that I share is we're here in Colorado, and my husband and I like to go to the University of Colorado basketball games, the college basketball games. And the coach, Tad Boyle, he had gone to college, and he was a pretty mediocre basketball player himself, but he really had a passion for the sport. And he ended up becoming a stockbroker. And this was 20 years ago. He was living up in Boulder. He was making six figures at the time, doing great. And one day he's in this like T-bone car crash.
Ooh.
And all of a sudden he has this huge wake-up call, like, holy cow, if I'm going to die, I'm going to go die doing what I love. You know, so he was very successful, but he quit everything. He walked away from everything, and he went and volunteered up in the Northeast, Washington or somewhere, volunteering as a basketball coach. And eventually someone put him on as a lower-level coach, and then he worked his way up all the way up to the University of Colorado. And now he's a terrific, popular, very successful coach. And it doesn't deny what happened to him. I'm sure he wishes he didn't have to be in a car crash. You know, the pain is still there, the suffering. He probably had some nightmares and that, but it ended up leading him to do what he really wanted to do. To me, that's a perfect example of post-traumatic growth.
Yes, ma'am, indeed. Yes, ma'am, indeed. So speaking of post-traumatic growth, I'm pretty sure there were some trials you had to overcome, especially with your training. So any trials that you have to overcome to get to where you currently are?
Yeah, I did. In the book, I spend a couple chapters just talking about what is trauma. And all of us can say, oh, it's the guy that goes to war and sees all kinds of brutal things. But trauma can be anything. It could be being bullied on the school playground, or a part of what makes something traumatic is what you say about an event. So, you know, if you wet your pants in kindergarten and you think, oh, that's the most embarrassing thing, that could be traumatic your whole life for you. So I talk about what trauma is in my own life. I don't necessarily think I had 1,000 times more trauma than anyone else, but I did have a lot of trauma. My parents, I grew up in a great big family, and they had adopted the first 4 kids one at a time. So my older brother, then the next brother, and then they adopted my twin sister and I. And then they had 3 more kids on their own. So they had this great big family, and I think they had really good intentions. But then my mom got a terminal illness, and in the midst of that, one of my oldest brothers was, I think he was a sociopath. He spent his whole life in prison. He was a sexual predator. So he was preying on all the girls in the family. So we had the sexual abuse. We had, I think my poor dad was trying to deal with all the, raising 7 kids, and he was a doctor in a small town. So he was trying to deal with the patient load. His wife's dying. One of his kids is crazy. And so he would rage. And he would be pretty physical and very scary at times. And also at other times he could be very loving and wonderful. So it's very unpredictable to know who you were going to deal with. And then it was crazy. My mom died 3 days before my high school graduation. But they had never told us she was going to die. And so it was one of those families where you're watching your mom waste away, like a Holocaust victim. And yet everyone's in denial and not admitting it and not saying it's happening. And yet you're having to carry her to the bathroom or whatever. So it was just a lot of chaos. And nobody knew really how to process it, to talk about things. So I just kind of buried the pain. And I think that pain waits. It waits patiently, and so it's like going in the trash compactor, and we're just squishing it down and squishing it down. But pain always comes out. It always finds a way out. And people are just creative in the ways they try to deal with it. So some people might become workaholics, and others might use drugs or alcohol, and some might have sex addictions. But pain always finds its way out. So until you deal with it, it's going to be there eating at you.
Yeah, it's true. It's like a giant T-bone steak in front of a fat guy who loves steaks. Like, he'll be eating. He'll be ready to eat. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, that was a good metaphor.
Yeah.
Oh. So I think I was 27 when I finally started to deal with the pain in my life. And at first I found a church and just a very loving pastor, just very kind and compassionate, and started to heal. But what I think I did is I thought, oh, if I do one more Bible study, that will heal all this pain and shame inside of me. So I just kept going to Bible studies and Bible studies and Bible studies, which was great. I learned a lot about the Bible, but my emotional pain was still there. So I was kind of getting things confused and not understanding that, yeah, spirituality can do a lot and can help a lot, but sometimes people need more. So eventually, I think I was 37, I think, when I went into my counseling program, and I really started to deal with, I felt like someone took a piece of yarn on a sweater and just pulled it, and then I just unraveled. And I thought, oh, gosh, this is so painful because everything was coming at me at once. And then one by one, I just started dealing with it. And I remember one day I woke up and I felt a breeze blowing across the bedroom. And I could hear the birds chirping. And it was like the first time in my life ever that I had felt this real true joy. And it wasn't that I was searching for that, but by dealing with all these painful things in my life, it kind of was the outcome of that.
Ah, yes. Kind of reminds me of I forgot what exact verse it was, but it's talking about how one person just learns, they're just ever learning but never coming to the truth, where they seek out so much knowledge from the outside, not realizing that it's not more studies that you need. You really just need to just realize, hey, the solution's within you already.
And I think this was a huge aha for me, is that we usually get hurt in relationships. So whether it's parenting or whatever, usually it takes another person to walk us on our journey of healing. So it's not necessarily a counselor, doing the work. We're the person doing all the work, but they're being the facilitator or the guide or the witness. And I'll tell you what, it was profoundly healing for me to start working with a counselor as I was going through my graduate program. I remember one time he just looked at me and I was telling a story. I don't even remember what the story was. And his eyes just filled with tears. And he said, "Your dad missed you." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Your dad, he missed you." And just seeing like the tears in his own eyes and the compassion and the love, and it was like a good, healthy, fatherly kind of love. It was so healing for me, like to see love reflected back towards me when I had never experienced that. So I do think that finding that safe person, and it may take a while to find, like whether it's a pastor or a counselor or a teacher or even just a good friend that will listen to you and not try to fix everything for you, can be so helpful. You know what I'm saying?
Yep, and that reminds me of this commercial I saw where it was this couple and the lady had the nail in her head.
I know exactly what you're talking about. That's hilarious. That's a good one. Oh.
It's like, yeah, especially for me. I know sometimes it's like, yeah, I just want to take the nail out your head and you can be healed and whole again. It's like, yeah, all right, cool. All right. What's for dinner? Like, what's the next thing? Let's go ahead and tackle this goal. But it's like, no, we have to talk about this pain.
You're like, take the thing out of your head. Oh. Yeah. And counseling's kind of mysterious to me, and I'm so grateful because I've been on the other side of it, and I've felt what it did for me, and so that helps me when I work with my clients. But really astounding and interesting thing is they've done all kinds of studies and research on does counseling work, and if so, which kind of counselor. And all they can say is, yes, counseling works, and that the number one thing is just it's all about goodness of fit. So does this person get me? Do I feel safe with this person? Do you think eventually I can open up to this person? And I didn't know all that. So there was a time period in there before I really started working through some things. I had a dog bite, and I became really phobic. I wouldn't go to my mailbox, and I was just petrified. And I went to this counselor, and I'm telling you, he could not have been a worse fit for me. He was awful. He was really awful. And he would always tell me, Lucille, there is no God. And then I was getting ready to go to Israel, and he was telling me I was crazy to go to Israel. And
Ouch.
He was real argumentative. And for some reason, I just kept going to him because I thought, well, someone said he's good with phobias. And I didn't understand that the most important thing is that connection you feel. And I wish someone had told me that. Saved me a lot of money.
I bet the couch was comfy at least, though.
Yeah. Yeah. So, anyway, I love my job. I'm very grateful for it. And that kind of goes along with this message of how tragedy can lead to remarkable and dramatic breakthroughs. And I feel like without the suffering, without the pain, without the healing that I myself have gone through, I wouldn't be a very good counselor. And so I look at my life. I don't look at it like, oh, poor me, poor victim. I look at it as, oh my gosh, look at all this good stuff I have to work with. And now I know what helps people. And I feel like it was a necessary part of my training in some ways.
Sounds awesome indeed. So for those who are looking to become counselors on their own after being inspired by you and or anyone else, what advice would you give them to get started on that journey?
Oh, boy. I think really because I didn't know anything. I didn't research at all what was going to be involved. But I think just to know that it is going to be an emotional journey for yourself. I think there are some programs out there that basically just teach you the material and don't make you even deal with anything in your own life. But I wouldn't think that was a very good program to go through. So I would definitely want it to be a self-reflective program. And just know that even if it's painful, it's a gift, it's a gift. Not only are you learning to have a career and to help other people, but you're also going to be doing a lot of your own healing.
Ah, that's true. Be a willing participant in your own rescue, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And I know you love research, so I'm pretty sure there's tons of books that have really inspired you. Willing to share any of the titles with us?
Oh, yeah. Well, that first book I mentioned, What Doesn't Kill Us, by Dr. Joseph, is great. I loved Sheryl Sheryl Sandberg, who's I think she's COO at Facebook.
Oh, yes, ma'am. Lean in, right?
Yes, Sheryl Sandberg, she was only 50, I think, when her husband died. They were on vacation, and that was about 2 years ago. And
that was rough.
Yeah, it was very unexpected. And so she wrote a book with a psychologist, Adam Grant, and it's called Option B, because she was just having a meltdown, and she was saying, I can't do this. I don't want to do this life without my husband. And she said a friend said to her, you know what? Option A is doing life with your husband, but you don't have option A, so let's do option B. So I think that's kind of a neat title there. I love books like, well, I don't know, some of your listeners might know Basil van der Kolk. He's one of the top researchers for PTSD. He has a crazy long name, Basil van der Kolk, and that's Kolk. But he has a fascinating book called The Body Keeps the Score.
Ooh.
And he talks about how trauma really gets into your body. It's not, it's not just in your thinking, it's your cells, it's in his book really he's just one of the top leaders in PTSD, and so he has some fascinating research about what helps people. And then just a little off topic, but it's really one of my favorite books. It's called The Myths of Happiness. And she has another book, The How of Happiness, and her name is Sonia. It's the craziest long name. It's like Lyuber-Mirsky. But anyway, if people look under happiness, like on Amazon or, did a search for happiness books, she would show up in one of the first books. So she basically goes through everything that people think will make them happy, whether it's having kids or getting married. And she just refutes these one by one based on the research. And then she goes into what really makes people have a sense of well-being and happiness in life. And so I like those kind of books, scientific evidence to show what makes people happy and thriving.
Yeah, it's true. And it kind of reminds me of Your Body Keeps Score. That title was, as soon as you said that, it just clicked to me. It's like, wait a second. It kind of reminds me of the whole getting older thing. It's not always just the body itself. It could be some pain or some situations that you may not have dealt with or taken care of that's actually aging you quicker than just regular aging.
It's so true. Let me think there's one other book just came out, and it's called The Deepest Well, Healing the Long-Term Effects of Childhood Adversity. And this is written by a medical doctor, Nadine Burke-Harris. And this is really such a fascinating thing. And what they did is Kaiser, the medical group Kaiser, like people go to Kaiser and see doctors. Well, they had hundreds of thousands of patients, and so they did a survey with their patients and said they had 10 different traumatic events that could happen to you in your childhood. And they asked people if any of these events happened to them, and if people had one of those things, then their risk of having certain diseases quadrupled. If people had two, then it went like a sky higher. And then if they had 3 or 4, and some people have 7, 8, 9 of these things, and they've directly linked these to health issues. So how it affects your mind, affects your physical body. And the 10 different things are things like, did you ever see did you ever see or experience physical abuse? Was anyone in your family an alcoholic? So it asks things about physical, mental, emotional, sexual abuse, and just fascinating to see how it really affects people's physical health.
Yeah, that's powerful indeed. Oh my gosh.
And her book is really readable because she tells all kinds of stories of children that she's seen in her clinic and then the outcomes. So that when I say the ACEs study, ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experience. Really interesting.
So no Ace of Spades?
Yeah, no Ace of Spades. Oh.
Yeah, I feel like I've seen that book before. I probably have them. I see books every day.
Yeah.
What a great array.
It's pretty new. It came out about 6 months ago, and it's gotten some really good reviews. So those are my books. I love books. Do you like to read, Dom?
Oh, yes, ma'am, I do. Yeah, probably go through 10 books at a time. Probably read about, I guess, maybe a couple chapters here and there, go to another book, and then alternating through other people's books. And with this podcast, that just amplifies.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's find something you want to read.
Oh, yes. Oh, I'll always have something to read. I work at a library full time. I got my own personal library at home. So
that's great.
Yep. Yeah, funny enough, I saw a little lapel on someone's name tag. It said, "We'll work for books." I'm like, yeah, yep, sounds like me.
You
right
would
now.
do that.
Oh, man. So if you were 25 in the current year of 2018 with all of your amassed knowledge, expertise, and experience, what advice would you give to yourself?
I think I would probably tell myself to deal with my hurts and my pain, my emotional pain, sooner than I did. And yet I kind of understand that our lives kind of work themselves out, and things happen for a reason and when you're ready for them to. But I kind of wish I had dealt with this pain sooner. I feel like I was a good mom, but there were times when I realized that I carried the same rage inside of me that I saw in my own dad. And so where I wasn't as physical, one time I went to reach out to my daughter to hug her, and she flinched. She was like 13, and she flinched. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I'm my dad. And I always say that I like metaphors. And so when we have all that pain inside us and we haven't dealt with it or healed it, then it's like a beach ball, and you're trying to hold a beach ball underwater. And at first it's easy, but then it gets harder and harder and harder to do. And that I say that that's kind of what emotional pain does to us, and that's what makes people have road rage and scream at their kids and snap at people and have what I say is like a short fuse, so it's like a candle wick, but they don't have a very long wick because they haven't dealt with those wounds and that pain. And I think I could have been a lot better mom if I had dealt with all this sooner.
Makes sense indeed. Try to get rid of the bad stuff per se as quickly as possible, or just deal with it while it's small before it becomes a skyscraper. It's either deal with it now or deal with it later.
That's true. It's true. It always comes out.
Sometimes out of a closet, right?
Yeah.
Well, alrighty, for those who want to keep in touch with the wonderful LZ and all that you're doing, maybe even come in for a session, how can we keep in contact with you?
Thanks. I have a website, and it's just my name, so it's Lucille, and then Zimmerman, ZIMMERMAN.com. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, and Facebook, so I'm not too hard to find.
Sweet! Well, there you have it, folks. Go on ahead and follow Lucille and all of her good things that she's got going on. Go on ahead and pick up 15 copies of her books and go ahead and share them with your friends and family, especially those who have gone through trauma, because believe it or not, the folks you may see with the smiling face may have went through something, or they may be going through something, and they may need to shift from post-traumatic stress to post-traumatic growth and become the giant tree of wisdom that they can be.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Dom.
Hey there, buddy. Looks like you made it to the end of this episode. Since you made it to the end of this episode, do both of us a favor and stop being greedy. Stop it right now. And share this episode with your friends and your fellow podcast lovers, especially those who have book clubs and want to listen to the authors who write some amazing books. Be sure to check out the rest of the backlog too while you're at it, and share all those too.